welcome back. You guys got more than 40 likes, so you get this bonus story. Now let's go. Also, be prepared and get ready for Hell Month. It is going to be awesome. I promise you guys. Some of the best stories you will ever hear in October leading up to Halloween. Now, make sure to also find the clue in today's story and put what it is with the timestamp in the comments, and those who get pinned get entered into a giveaway every 6 months. So, without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. Sarah Ann Ricketts was 79 years old, and she lived alone in the seaside town of Blackpool, England. She was known to be a lively old soul with a liking for some rum or some brandy and an addiction to raspberry jam, which she would eat by the spoonful. But her life had also been touched with so much tragedy. 2 husbands had died in the very bungalow where she now lived. Both had committed suicide by putting their heads in the gas oven. Both of them. Now, with these tragic events, along with her being alone, people wonder if this is why she chose to employ a housekeeper. And in early 1953, she placed an advertisement in the local newspaper for a live-in caretaker. And one of those who applied was 46-year-old Louisa May Merrifield. And like Ricketts, Louisa was twice widowed, although her husbands have died of natural causes. But currently, she was married to Albert Merrifield, who, at 71 years old, was 25 years her senior. Louisa had met Albert while visiting her previous husband in the hospital and had tied the knot with him shortly after she was widowed for a second time. Those who met Albert said that he was a little odd and not the sharpest tool in the shed, but aside from her unusual marriage, there were other things about Louisa that seemed a bit odd. One was that she had a criminal record of having been convicted of ration book fraud, and the other was that she held down 20 housekeeping jobs just over the last 3 years. Come on, that statistic tells its own story, but Louisa must nonetheless have made a positive impression on Mrs. Ricketts because she hired her right there on the spot. And at first, Louisa and Albert, they got along great with their new employer. In fact, Mrs. Ricketts took such a liking to Louisa and Albert that she changed her will, leaving her bungalow to them, and in the process, disinheriting her only daughter. Yes, she literally took her only daughter out of her will. And it wasn't that long after that things started to change. Mrs. Ricketts was complaining to the drivers who delivered groceries to the address that she was barely being fed and that her employees were drinking a lot and disrespecting the home. And in the meantime, Louisa May was making a name in the neighborhood, and not as a good neighbor, but as someone who was prone to making thoughtless or disgusting comments. She once told a woman that she had only just met at a bus stop that she'd caught her husband in bed with the old lady, and that if it happened again, she'd poison the old hag and him as well. Then to a friend, Veronica King, she boasted that she had inherited a 3,000-pound bungalow in Devonshire Road, Blackpool. Then when Mrs. King expressed surprise and said she hadn't realized that Mrs. Ricketts had died, Louisa quickly corrected her by saying,
"Oh, she's not dead yet, but she will be soon."
Then on April 10th, 1953, Louisa called her employer's regular physician, Dr. Yule, and asked him to certify that Mrs. Ricketts was of sound mind. Now, the reason for this odd request, she explained, was because she feared the old lady might die soon. And since Mrs. Ricketts had recently amended her will, she didn't want her relatives challenging it. And Dr. Yule was happy to confirm that Mrs. Ricketts was quite sane. He also added that he did not expect her to die anytime soon. Just 3 days later, however, Louisa was on the phone again, this time in a panic. And according to her, Mrs. Ricketts was at death's door, and she told the doctor to come immediately. And since Dr. Yule was unavailable at that time, it was his partner, Dr. Wood, who examined Mrs. Ricketts. And Louisa seemed almost annoyed when the doctor informed her that Mrs. Ricketts was suffering from a mild case of bronchitis. It would be all well soon. But that diagnosis, unfortunately, would prove to be inaccurate. You see, the next morning on April 14th, Dr. Wood was again called to the house, and this time he found Miss Ricketts deceased. Wood then called Dr. Yule, who would have to issue the death certificate, but Yule, however, refused and insisted on a post-mortem. That examination had not yet been carried out when the police began to get calls from friends and neighbors of Mrs. Ricketts, voicing suspicions about the possible involvement of Louisa and Albert Merrifield in Mrs. Ricketts' death. Sarah Ann Ricketts had died just 5 days after Louisa Merrifield had expressed concerns about the validity of her will. So they sent a journalist named Mr. E-Files to get the true scoop on what was going on. And I discovered that all of this was a sham. And I whipped out my handcuffs and put Louisa in the back of an old prison carriage in front of other reporters. And I looked at their cameras and I said, I solved the case. Make sure to subscribe 200 years from now to Mr. E-Files on YouTube. The crowd then cheered as I waved, and Mr. E-Files myself retreated to my time machine. Anywho, 5 days, and then she was deceased. That alone seemed very suspicious, and the results of the autopsy would do nothing to dissuade the notion that Louisa had something to do with her death. But the pathologist found evidence of phosphorus poisoning, which he believed might have come from a commonly used brand of rat poison called rhodine. Finding evidence of poisoning and proving who had administered the poison were, however, two entirely different things. Both Albert and Louisa stoutly denied harming their employer, and searches of the residence and garden turned up no trace of rhodine. Neither was there any evidence that either Mrs. Ricketts or the Merrifields had ever bought that rat poison. So, were the police mistaken? I mean, Louisa Merrifield certainly did not act like a murder suspect. While the police were carrying out their search at the bungalow, she hired the local Salvation Army band to stand in the garden and play Abide With Me. And then when journalists started showing up to cover the story, she carried out trays of tea and cake to them. And she seemed just relaxed and jovial, and that's what they wrote in their papers. More than one writer admitted in his column that he liked her. The authorities, though, were of a different opinion. Now, despite having no evidence outside of local gossip, Alfred and Louisa Merrifield were arrested and charged with murder. The trial of the Merrifields was held at Manchester Assizes and was a major media event in Blackpool and beyond. Throughout it all, Louisa maintained her jolly exterior, arriving each day in a taxi, smiling and waving to the gathering crowds. She appeared to be enjoying herself, and why wouldn't she? I mean, after a lifetime of faceless drudgery, she was the center of attention, with camera flashes popping around her and newspaper headlines carrying her name. She also had every prospect of being acquitted. I mean, other than a few ill-said comments, what evidence did the prosecution have against her? Really? I mean, there was nothing that linked her to buying the rhodine, much less administering it to the old lady. In fact, even the cause of death was now being disputed, and at least one distinguished expert stated on record that Mrs. Ricketts had not died of phosphorus poisoning, but of liver failure brought on by old age and an eccentric diet. But luckily, justice is blind. because unfortunately for Louisa, the people she most needed to impress, aka the jury, were not convinced of her innocence. All of those off-color remarks about Mrs. Ricketts' impending demise now came back to haunt Louisa. So too did her tardiness in summoning a doctor to attend to Mrs. Ricketts. According to Merrifield's own testimony, the elderly woman had fallen ill on the night of April 13th, but she'd waited until the next morning to call Dr. Wood. And then there was Louisa's actions after Mrs. Ricketts died. She immediately tried to arrange a cremation, which is not sketchy at all, stating that it had been the old woman's dying wish, something that the Ricketts family disputed. But the thing that arguably counted most against Louisa Merrifield was her light-hearted attitude to her employer's tragic death. They could see through her like a glass bottle, and all of those movie star entrances had made a poor impression on the jury, so they found Louisa May Merrifield guilty of murder, while acquitting her husband, who the judge had memorably labeled a tragic simpleton. The sentence of the court was then death by hanging. And Louisa May Merrifield died on the gallows at Manchester Strangeways Prison on September 18th, 1953. And in the aftermath of his wife's death, Albert Merrifield returned to the Devonshire Road bungalow, which he now owned. And he later gave up his claim to the property in order to avoid a legal battle with the Ricketts family. Albert would live for 9 more years, during which he was a popular sideshow attraction in Blackpool, talking about the town's most infamous murder, the one which his wife committed. The moral of the story is never write your family out of a will just because at first you get along with your housekeeper. I'm sure if Mrs. Ricketts was alive, she would tell you the same thing right now. But that's all I have for you today, so please make sure to get this up to 45 likes, and I will see you on Friday. Cheers.